Okay, so in these last couple lectures, I want to talk about a question that's a bit different from civil disobedience. It's related, but I think it's different enough we should deal with it under, a different heading. And that's the question of exemptions to the law for conscience. Now, in a sense, civil disobedience claims, a justification to break the law because of conscience. But I think there are cases of personal conscience that are a bit different. So if we look at someone like King or Thoreau, they are making moral claims they think everyone should accept. As Americans who believe in basic rights for all people and equality, you should not accept slavery or segregation, right? Not everyone's going to agree with them, but these are moral claims that they think every person could accept, probably should accept, right? King and Thoreau definitely think they should. Hopefully, we all now think they should as well, right? More disagreement maybe with Snowden and Ellsberg, but at least they would make a claim that they would think the general public could agree to, right? Well, conscience, personal conscience is a bit different, right? What if I think that something's wrong or think that something's required, but I think that there's no chance you're going to agree with me, right? Um, what about when you have a claim for personal conscience you don't think other people will accept, could even in principle accept, right? Um, some good examples of this are personal religious commitments, right? You know, if you are an Orthodox Jew, you think it's wrong to work on the Sabbath, right? If you're not religious, you would think nobody else, if somebody's an atheist, there's just nothing you're going to say that they're going to share that commitment. Oh, it's wrong to work on the Sabbath, right? You know, if you are a member of certain peace churches, the Mennonites are one of them, you might think that war is wrong in all cases. You would be a pacifist, right? Some people without religious commitments are pacifists, right? Now, that's a very different thing, being a pacifist thinking that war is always wrong, than thinking, say, the Vietnam War or the Iraq War or a specific war is wrong, right? You know, you might think, as a lot of people do, that some specific wars, the Mexican American War, the Vietnam War, whatever, are wrong, while thinking, well, some wars can be justified, right? A pacifist, be they a religious pacifist or one not on religious grounds, thinks that all wars are wrong. And if you're a pacifist, you're probably going to say, well, look, I know I'm not going to convince most people of this. This is what my conscience tells me. You should make some exemptions for me, right? I think war is always wrong. Don't force me to go fight. What do we do when people make these claims for religious exemptions, right? Lots of cases, right? Some Native American churches want to use drugs, peyote, in their rituals. Well, they want exemptions to the laws for this on grounds of religion, right? We'll talk about the infamous cake baker case, or I guess it's infamous, in Colorado. He says, my religious commitment, my conscience won't permit me to make this cake for a same-sex wedding. You should exempt, you should let me out of the law that would otherwise require me to do this. Well, a great way to think about these issues, or at least to start thinking about them, is to look at the case of Wisconsin v. Yoder. This involved old order Mennonites as well as some Amish. The lines between the more conservative or Orthodox Mennonites and the Amish are pretty blurry. I think I've said this before. I have fair amount of family on my dad's side who, in fact, are Mennonites. They range from people who you couldn't tell from your garden variety Presbyterian, we went to Mennonite churches that were like that, to people who are pretty much indistinguishable from the Amish. The Mennonites, in the Yoder case, very close to the Amish, right? And the Mennonites and Amish in this case said, well, look, you have a state law that says we have to leave our children in school until they're 16. Do the math, I think that's 10th grade. We want to pull our children out of school in the 8th grade. We think we shouldn't have to send our children to school this far because we think 8th grade is all the education they need to be a member of our community, to succeed in our community. Yes, we think people should learn basic literacy and math. They don't need to learn these other skills for success in the modern world because our culture is not part of that world. It deliberately puts it at arm's length in a lot of ways, right? So this is an interesting case because it's, the Mennonites in this case are not going to say, well, the rest of you are going to share this commitment. You are not members of our religion, but even though you don't share our moral commitment, we ask you to carve out a space to allow us to live in line with it. I also like this case because if you think back to Dworkin, if you think back to the stuff on rights, Dworkin talks about, when rights come into the issue, or rights come into the question, you have to do this balancing act, right? Wisconsin v. Yoder is an example, a good example of the Supreme Court or trying to do this balancing act, right? Okay. So what are the conflict of rights here? The basic conflict of rights is, I think, this. The parents' right to practice their religion, maybe also their right to raise their children as they see fit, which, that overlaps with the right to religion, versus, and Douglas talks about this, the children's right to an education, the right to opportunity, right? Think back to the UN Declaration of Rights. This isn't mentioned in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, but I think most of us would think children have a right to an education. Well, seems like there's a conflict here between the parents' religion and the children's right to an education, maybe also their right to equal opportunity, right? A lot of opportunities, a lot of doors are going to be closed to you if you only have an 8th grade education. This was a case in the 70s, good Lord, nowadays, a lot of doors are going to be closed to you if you only have a 10th grade or a 12th grade education, but, the issues have only gotten more pressing. So look, if we are not Mennonites, if we don't share these parents' commitments, if we don't think, well, we don't want our children, or it's, valuable for your children to keep space from the modern world, why do we want to allow them to do this, right? And it's not enough for you to say, oh, well, we have freedom of religion in this country. Why is that important? And I think we can give a couple reasons for this. One is just a respect for autonomy, a respect for freedom, a respect for people making their own choices. Remember, respect for autonomy doesn't mean we think your choices are always good. The Kantian thought is we have to respect people's choices even if we might not agree with them. Another thought here, and I didn't have you guys read this article. He goes on a long time to make a very interesting but fairly basic point. James Childress has written on this idea, well, if we force people to violate their conscience, this in a very real sense harms them. I mean, it can be more harmful than, say, a physical harm, right? And in the same way that we would think the state needs a darn good reason to break your arm, they need a darn good reason to do the sort of harm that they would do if they forced people to violate their conscience. I might not agree with your conscience. I might think what your conscience dictates to you is crazy. But if possible, I should allow you to follow your conscience because forcing you to violate it is a very serious harm. Okay, ultimately, with these reasons in mind, the court did decide for the parents. Um, you know, parents' right to religion, the thought, well, this is part of your conscience to raise your kids in this way. But also, I think some deeper reasons that made this case special and ones that they talk about in the decision. And one of these is that these children, as part of this community, they can have a pretty good life within the community, right? They might not be able to get jobs outside the community if they leave school in the 8th grade, but they can get jobs within the community. They won't have a bad life just because they drop out of school. You know, a parent who's not part of this traditional community, they just pull their kids out of school in the 8th grade. Well, it'd be way worse because there's not this community the children can have success in with that level of education, right? And the court said, look, the Mennonites, the Amish are exceptional. There are reasons to give them exemptions that won't apply to everybody. There's this community that children can be part of and be successful. There is this obvious, sincere religious commitment. This case, we have to apply the law objectively, but if we do that, we have good reasons why we don't just let any person yank their kids out of school whenever they want to, right? We can carve out principled space for these people to pull their children out of school early without having to allow anybody who just doesn't want to send their kids to school not to do it, right? So Dworkin also talks about this, and I think this is a good example of what he talks about. When we're talking about these exemptions for conscience, for people doing what they feel is right, we have to think of the wider effects. If we grant it in this case, what other cases will we have to grant it? And the court says, well, there's principled reasons that this decision won't expand too widely. We won't have to, just let other people pull their kids out of school whenever. This will, I think, be a difference with the cake baker case. This will be interesting to keep in mind. Now, one thing I want to stop with here, and I don't know what to make of it. I'm not going to say the court decided this case wrongly, but I think it is worth talking about Justice Douglas's worry. Does this, Douglas eventually, he found for the parents, but he was a bit uneasy about it if you read the decision. And he's uneasy about this because does it respect the children's autonomy, right? By letting their parents pull them out of school in the 8th grade, you are limiting their opportunities. You are taking some choices away from them. And now it's interesting. In another class, I'll often give my students a case study about deaf parents using genetic technology to deliberately have deaf children. And usually, not always, but usually, people will be against this, sometimes even very outraged that deaf parents would think of doing this, right? It's unclear how often deaf parents have done this. It does seem to happen. It's unclear how common it is, right? But I'll always ask my students, I'll bring up the Yoder case and I'll say, well, look, do you agree with the Yoder decision? And they'll always be, yes, we agree with the Yoder decision. Obviously, freedom of religion, yay America, right? And then I'll press them. I'm like, well, how can you think that the Yoder decision is perfectly okay? You say it's fine for the parents to do this to continue their culture. At the same time, you condemn deaf parents for wanting to have deaf children, but deaf parents will say, well, we want our children to be deaf so they'll be part of our culture, so they'll learn and communicate primarily through sign language. And people always say, well, deaf parents, deprive their children of opportunities. And I'll say, yeah, well, but the same thing goes for the Mennonite parents in Yoder. What's the difference? Maybe there is a difference. I just find when I give this to students, people struggle to articulate exactly what it is. So I don't know what to do with that. That's just, as philosophy is, it's often interesting something to think about. If you really think that Yoder is correct, but you think deaf parents who want to have deaf children are acting wrongly, I think you need to think a bit about why that is. I'm not saying there's not a good answer to how these cases are different, but if you want to say they are, you need to give a good account of why. Anyway, sorry, I just think it's an interesting issue to think about. It's a pretty deep one. Parents' interest in continuing their culture, raising their children in their culture versus, opportunities for children, choices for them, right? All right. Super complex issue. I'll stop there because I could probably go on all semester about this, and there are other things I want to cover.